For tonight's screening of Little Richard, I Am Everything, we have the director and producer and longtime friend, Lisa Cortez, here as our guest for the Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Lisa. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. When you texted and told me about this incredible film club, I was so excited to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled to have you. So first question off the top is, what was your inspiration for making this film now? And how did it come to be, and how did you assemble your partners on the project?
I love this question because, you know, when you get to the end of a film, sometimes you forget about what brought you there. And so when Little Richard passed away in May of 2020, I think we all know it was, you know, those crazy early dark days of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I was finishing off All in the Fight for Democracy, the film that I made with 𝙀𝙬𝙀𝙀, and was starting to think about what I wanted to do next. With his passing, there were so many interesting people who talked about how important he was to them. And, you know, whether it's Dave Grohl and the Foo Fighters or Robbie Robertson or other great artists, I was like, wow, he had this, he meant so much to people.
Mm-hmm.
And there hasn't been a doc about him.
Yes.
And so of course that becomes this great runway to approach the storytelling. It is both exciting, but it's also daunting, because when story has never been told before, it's like, whoa, what's the focus? What is the thesis? And I knew I did not want to make a, you know, cradle to grave story. I wanted to find something that has a resonance to why now. So the why now for me with this story is that it's not just about Richard and his music. It's also about how, as a transgressive figure, he contributed to great cultural change. There are so many things that we see now when it comes to fluidity, or many of my male friends who have better manicures with fabulous colors than I do, that, you know, I see that Richard starts this ability to be expressive and not be contained by gender norms. Why now, especially, is we are seeing a pushback in certain states, Florida, Tennessee, about people who express themselves differently, and this being criminalized. And that, you know, this is a story that leans into the innovation that came from a Black queer person in a time where we're also seeing a pushback for African American history being taught in a full, inclusive way. And so this story of Richard speaks to a bigger American story, and our uneasy embrace of outliers, but the importance of outliers for cultural change and on so many levels.
Yeah, you said a lot in just a couple of minutes there, and it's you know, both in terms of where we are now as a sort of socio-political cauldron of a country, and also just who he was and his deeply lasting mark. You know, you know, I think that you could not have landed on a more apt title for this film, you know, because, you know, on the one hand, transgressive, totally accurate way to describe him, but yet he was magically also a household name. He was crossover as crossover gets. You know, he was you know, mainstream. You know, he was you know, a household name. You know, these super, you know, vanilla mainstream artists were covering his music, you know, and it's really you know, a testament to what a an embodiment of contradictions he was. And so skipping, because you kind of ended up answering my second question, which was, how did you, he's such, his character, both his character as well as his life are both so expansive. How in the world did you find, the first big tackle, or the first big hurdle must have been, finding the boundaries to the story. I was curious about that, but you spoke to that really, really. So
I can add though to like that first step about process. So, initially it's like, okay, he wrote a book, his autobiography, reading that, and it introduces in the book some of the important characters in his life, like Bumps Blackwell, the A&R person from Specialty Records, who is with him when he creates Tutti Frutti and kind of like signs him and brings him to the label. Then there are other books that people wrote about him. A ton of, YouTube searches. And what immediately came to mind was Richard's desire to have agency in his life, to tell his story, to be recognized. And so then I thought, like, well, Richard, you got to tell your story. So we did a very big, deep archival dive to see what materials were there throughout the arc of his life, from the early days, or so that he could be the guide. Now, the next part of it is, we know Richard's not always the most reliable narrator. And that's the role of what I call the Greek chorus, which consists of family and friends, scholars, and other notable musicians. Right. So they are there to be at times in dialogue with things that Richard is telling us. They are there to give you the emotional connection that they have to him, to help to fill out and expand the story.
Yeah, and to show how, and I think your Greek chorus is really aptly deployed, in terms of rounding out his version and grounding it. And it's also a nice cross section, like from people, like really truly going back to his roots, the hidden chapters, up to Billy Porter and Mick Jagger, and how many, even iconic, cultural vanguards like Little Richard, how many people can say they so deeply influenced both Mick Jagger and Billy Porter? It's really, it's really quite cool when you think about it. So in terms of of the many things I like about the film, because I really liked it immensely, and I had the treat of seeing it on the big screen first at Sundance, and then did some tune-up screening to prep for this interview. But it was really exciting to see on the big screen at a festival, and going in without seeing too much of it, or knowing too much about it beforehand. But I loved so many of your creative choices, and after seeing it in entirety, it's sort of like, well, of course, if you're going to make a profile doc of Little Richard, it can't just be cut and dried. You're going to have to throw some sort of sequins in there at some point. So I was just curious how, when, and why did you choose to use sort of creative flair at the moments when you did? Because I really thought it created a really nice energy to the film. It felt representative of of his ethos in general. So I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I think the spirit of Little Richard is one of innovation, of boldness, of taking those crayons and coloring outside the lines. And with the genre of documentary, and specific with music, I think there's been a lot of traditions and conventions. And it was important for me to kind of break the fourth wall, do a little bit of decolonizing of how you tell a story. And what was most important was being immersive. I didn't want just to be from the outside looking in. I wanted always to find conventions to bring us into the interiority of Richard's world. So from the beginning, in pitching this film to find someone to fund it, I always talked about this desire to have dreamscapes. The dreamscapes being these seminal moments in Richard's life where a portal opens and he sees possibility, whether it's meeting Sister Rosetta Tharpe or it is that creation of 𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀. In all of the dreamscapes, there are these particles that are happening. And that's part of the visual vocabulary that's established from the beginning of the film. It is important to position Richard as supernatural, otherworldly, and having this dynamic energy that is not static. It is an energy as sown by the particles that has been distributed in some way or another to all of us. I always like to say we all have a little bit of Little Richard's DNA. And then there's also these montages when there are great moments of breakthrough and joy and discovery. And those were, created with a desire to liken this to like the Big Bang, but the Big Bang of rock and roll. And, my editor, Nenev Minier, Jake Hofstadter, just really took the idea and ran with it and just was like, okay, here's a way to take an emotionality and turn it into a visual montage that takes people back to that moment. I just screened recently at a festival, and people who were teens during, in 1955 came to see the film. And these folks were like, wow, you helped me remember what it was to discover, to be a teenager and sneaking out to go to these dances or hear this music. And, I think that the visuals and are a part of tapping into memory and to tapping into a different kind of memory.
Yeah, no, I really liked it. And, I think, big swings don't always work. And I think it was a case of, you took a big swing with this creative framing or this visual framing. And I think it really worked. I really loved it. And I think it was just, just was very successful with setting a tone, everything from, the title treatment to, to, any of the on-screen graphics throughout really, really worked. So as
I like how it explodes on my name. That's my favorite part.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I love it. As it's just a phenomenal energy, which is channeling his energy. But just to speak about I'll be honest, I knew Richard as a musician more, as I read in some of the press notes that you encountered some people who knew him more as a sort of larger than life pop culture icon, sort of like broad-based pop culture icon. I really knew him as a musician. And so, he was such an iconic musician, almost this like, going back to something you said earlier, like almost this like otherworldly, like he like from the day he was born, he was going to be a big musician. Like it was just this, undeniable force of talent. And then not only did he have this undeniable force of talent, it was coupled with this massive, sort of charisma, like that, this stage presence and swagger and personality. And that those two things together, the whole was bigger than the sum of the parts. He was this, incredible entertainer. But then, cut to that, for me, the reveal was like the degree to which he was tortured. and the inner turmoil. That was really, enlightening to me as a viewer. And he has this for a guy who had this face that was so, this like happy entertainer, he was so tortured. And, I would love to hear you editorialize a little bit on what you think was the root of how tortured he was. Was it, and of course some of this comes through in your storytelling, but do you think it was the religion, the ethics of the day, Southern machismo, or some combination thereof?
Yeah, Richard is quite a unique gumbo in terms of his origin story in the South, 1932, being queer, and being kicked out of his house as a teen. But who would have thought that he could then, in Macon, Georgia, go to Ann's TikTok and find a community of Black and white queer people who accept him, and then propel him. It helps to propel him on a journey, to go to the vaudeville and the Chitlin circuit and perform in drag and meet these artists who teach him and do not treat him differently, but actually embrace him in the process. But you cannot, he cannot run away from what was drummed into him, from his background, and what the church taught, or how it was interpreted, what the church taught. And so that was this pendulum that I was always keeping my mind on in the storytelling. Like, where is he at this point in terms of his embracing his full self or running away from who he is? And that adds such a beautiful layer of poignancy to counterpoint all that's happening with the music and meeting the Beatles and, being in films. There is this underlying tension, or even an undertow, so to speak, that is always still pulling at him. And that's what makes him beautifully human.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about that, as I was reflecting on the film before talking to you, and I was like, well, I'm looking for some logic in this behavior pattern, having, on the one hand, this, extraordinary swagger. Like, he was so, there's no way he could have been able to perform the way he did, the way he was able to, engage with, people on interviews and whatnot with, in such a, with such swagger and confidence and irreverence. But then that, he would then revert to the self-denial that was heartbreaking. You're looking for logic in human nature, which is nothing if not, irrational most of the time. But it really, I think you portray a very sympathetic portrait of him. And, I really felt like, couldn't help but ask myself, like, what would happen if he were, born, 20 years later? And, would he have had an easier path? And I think, another compliment to you as a filmmaker and the work that you did here is, I see a lot of films in my work, and, sometimes you see a profile of someone from another era, and you're sort of like, well, the why today question simply wasn't answered, or, you wonder, like, okay, this is great. This is going to be great for the people who listened to Tutti Frutti when they were in their, teens, 20s, or 30s. And, I can easily see a teenager appreciating this film, like a teen of the 2020s appreciating this film fully. And is that so my next question is, to what extent were you thinking about your audience and the audience you were trying to reach as you were making this film, if at all? And maybe you were just looking to tell the story you were looking to tell.
Well, I was looking to always honor him without making a film that was about hagiography.
Mhm.
You know, it would be easy to be like, he was the first at this and he did that, and isn't that wonderful? But there was, and I hope it comes through, a desire to peel the onion, you know,
Mhm.
to see all the different layers that went into this, you know, complemented genius.
Mhm.
And for audience, it's I think with Richard especially, it's about having an intergenerational reach. And I've seen that. I've seen, like, with my goddaughter, who was just like, wow, I kind of knew the song, but I knew nothing about him, and I knew nothing about, you know, his place in this spectrum of music and fashion and social norms. To 85-year-olds who were like, you know, I saw him at this place and snuck out of the house. And so I love that there are various entry points to connecting with his story and learning something new, and seeing the bigger thesis, which I think is a great takeaway, which has not been talked about in this forum, about who are the foremothers and forefathers of rock and roll, and adding them to the scaffolding of, you know, what is one of the most, I think, greatest American exports to the world is rock and roll. But
Mhm.
we don't talk about, you know, too many people pre Elvis, in the in most of the storytelling.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. And further, it just shows, you know, why it's important for a film like this to be made now. Because I think, you know, you ask any of, you know, I'm sure Elvis, were he alive today, would be, you know, quick to give little Richard credit. And you hear, you know, Mick Jagger, you know, who is, I'm sure, you know, credited with, you know, being one of the, you know, groundbreakers of rock and roll, and you know, rightfully so to a degree. But you know, little Richard came before him and helped him, you know, become the musician who he was. And I think it's really great that he credits little Richard so freely and abundantly. It's a great interview you got with him. Yeah, no, I think it's really important. And were there other musicians who you you know, other of your favorite interviews in terms of speaking to that point of giving him credit for being an early, you know, basically being the groundbreaker, for one of the key groundbreakers for rock and roll?
I enjoyed speaking with Nile Rodgers.
Mm-hmm.
He's such an incredible musician
Mm-hmm.
and producer. And you know, many people might not remember, like, first of all, Nile Rodgers is, you know, produces Madonna's early records, so he's been making hits for a
Right.
long time, in addition to being a member of Chic with all of their great hits. And I just loved hearing his perspective, as a performer and as a producer, about the importance of Richard, and the effect that it could have on an artist like David Bowie, saying, you know, Richard's style, his swag, his vibe, I want my album to sound like that.
Right.
That's a very high level concept of
Right.
translation of this essential energy that Richard had, and how it spoke to other musicians like a David Bowie.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's great. So how has it been promoting the film to audiences at the film festivals and on the film festival circuit? I mean, the reception at Sundance has been great. Have you found that people are surprised at what the little Richard they're seeing in this film, or are they, you know, sort of embracing it? You know, how's the reception been in terms of the portrait you're painting?
Um, I love screening this film and doing the Q&As,
Mhm.
because the range of comments vary. Whether it's the 13-year-old who says, I kind of see myself and how I want to express myself in this film, to the, elders who have been like, yeah, I remember, like, that we would go to the record shop, and there was a room in the back where they would play 45s. And at first we could only hear white artists, and then we could hear black artists, and how it changed. There, as one man said, his life went from black and white to, chroma color. So it's had this really beautiful embrace. Usually Q&As, they have to kick us out so that the next film could start, because so many questions come up about Richard and how do you make a deeply layered, complex film with a lot of archival and music, which of course speaks to the wonderful team, that I worked with, who just saw that there was bigger vision, and we really wanted to honor him in a way that he had not received or felt he received while he was alive. And I know some family members and friends, that's when it really hits me, have said, he would have loved this film. He might, and he would have loved the adulation that would have come to him.
Right. Yeah, no, he seemed to love having an audience. I mean, not to say that I would ever claim to be an expert on him, but I was surprised. Like, I feel like I thought I knew half the story, and I learned so much. Not only was it an enjoyable ride, like I really loved how much I learned about this extraordinary musician. So hats off, Lisa. It's really terrific. And I'm sure our audience has appreciated it. So want to flag that the film is opening on April 11th, and we wish you the best with the opening. And I know that it's got a little bit of a unique release strategy. You're doing one night only special event screenings on the 11th, and then a week or so later, you're opening a little bit more widely. So
yes, on the 21st with our partners at Magnolia Pictures. It will then be broadcast later on CNN, and it will ultimately live on HBO Max.
Yeah, so you're lots of chances, but I can attest that well, I guess our audience will be able to attest too that it looks phenomenal on the big screen. So thank you so much for your time, Lisa. Really loved hearing more about the backstory of the film and how it came to be.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for watching Little Richard, I Am Everything.